Imagine yourself looking out at the vast sea before you. You reach down and you put a hand into the water and you scoop it up towards you. Immediately the water starts leaking through your fingers until the hand is empty. That water is a man's life. From birth to death, it is always slipping through our hands until it is gone, along with all that you hold dear in this world.
Hey guys, I'm Luke. The world is a really weird place. So many people are lost, but fortunately, a lot of people are at least working that out. And I'm here to take the gloves off and explore the question, what's the point anyway? I went through my own deep exploration on this question over the past 5 years, and after 30 years of atheism, I became a Christian. I'm not really a typical Christian or churchgoer. In fact, I really struggle with much of what modern Christianity projects itself to the wider world. And I'd actually disagree with more Christians than I agree on with what the point is anyway. So what I want to do with this podcast is bring on guests with all different worldviews and put their perspectives in the furnace of ideas and really challenge them to find out which ones make the most sense. I believe that the truth is knowable, and through vigorous debate and questioning, we can uncover it. Join me as I stress test all these ideas and try to answer the question of what the point is anyway. Welcome back to What's the Point Anyway? Joining me today from Idaho is Joel Rosenauer. I've sat down several times to try and write a little intro for Joel, and I keep getting stuck. On the surface, Joel's bio is pretty straight up and down. A pastor's kid who became a pastor himself. But the story of what's in between is what makes Joel such a compelling guest. There's drug addictions, stints as an atheist, and as recently as a couple of years ago, the experience of getting sacked as a pastor and losing everything that most people would say matters. And yet Joel refuses to wallow in the mire and is a beacon of light to those around him. Joel, thanks for coming on to thrash out the big question. Can you tell me what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I ask, what's the point anyway?
What's the point anyway? I think there's a scripture that says, in him, in Jesus, we live and move and have our being. And I feel like we were created to worship our Father through Jesus. And when we do that, we have tremendous purpose, even in the midst of sometimes significant difficulties.
And you certainly speak that verse from personal experience.
Yep, for sure.
I thought, I think a lot of people listening to this wouldn't have heard your story. I've been fortunate enough to listen to, a bunch of interviews that you've done, but I'd love you to maybe just share a bit of it in your own words. I think the best place to start in terms of shaping the man that is Joel Rosenauer today, that's shaped that worldview, I guess, that you just said about your early years and upbringing. I said there that you're this pastor's kid. I think for most people looking at that, they'd think, a guy that grows up Christian and is taught everything Christian and then becomes a Christian older is sort of pretty standard and boring, but it's definitely not that. So can you talk about your early years?
Yeah, and first, thanks for having me on. It's a real privilege to be here, and hello to any of your audience. So as you mentioned, Dad is a pastor. I grew up in the Lutheran church, and so when you're a pastor's kid, it's just kind of your life. You're showing up church building Sunday mornings and different activities during the week. And I was up there sometimes. I had an older brother, and you're just kind of running around. That's kind of your life. You're at home or you're up at the church building, and I would say, that was kind of the only world I knew. And so when I was younger, I probably didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about why I believed those things or whether they were true. But then when I got a little older, probably we moved a couple of times too, because of my dad's job and getting called to be a pastor at different places, and that affects things. You meet different people, experience different different things. And probably even like junior high, I did start questioning things. Not in any type of negative way, but just kind of wondering, okay, is this really true? Or I've heard this, but here's another view. And in fact, I drove my mom nuts. I was kind of one of those, why? But why? Why? And she didn't really just want to talk about it too much. But I do remember I've always been somebody who's, I mean, there are people that study more, but I've always really wanted to know, I guess, if I'm doing something, if I believe it, what to kind of borrow your line from your program, what's the point anyway? And so I kind of delve deep into whatever I'm into. And so I remember one particular occasion where, I mean, I knew that the whole Christian faith really was based on the resurrection of Jesus. And it seemed to me, and this was probably kind of judgmental, but I was with a lot of these other people that were adults that believed these things, and I thought, but they didn't always seem to have a lot of joy. I mean, I had some good experiences with some people, but it just seemed like people kind of showing up and just going through the motions. And I was thinking, if this is really true, like we should be the most excited people around, and we should want to tell everybody about this stuff. And I just wasn't seeing a lot of that. And then so that got me questioning, well, did this really happen or not? And then when I got later in high school, and then into especially in college, I was kind of been a lifelong musician, and when I got into college, I got into some bands and stuff, and that's when I got into using alcohol and drugs, like very, very heavily. And my brother was my only sibling, and unfortunately, he died at 35. He had been a long time heroin addict and other drugs, and so he had gotten into that lifestyle, before I did. Probably for him, late junior high school. And
how far apart were you guys? Sorry to interrupt.
No, 2 years. He was 2 years older, almost exactly. We were both born in April, so
yeah.
But when I saw that, it's interesting because just about everything in my life, Luke, where I've thought I'm never going to be that, I'm never going to do that, I've ended up doing that and being that, and he was just out of control, and had actually a big influence in my life in a lot of ways, and not always a good one. But when I saw his life and what he was doing, I think that was one of the things that got me questioning a little bit if there's a God and these things are true, and why is he behaving like that? It was really affecting our family in a very negative way. And that's when I thought, I'm never going to drink. I'm never going to do drugs. I'm never going to do all this. And then later in high school, and I don't know why I started doing those things, but just going to some parties or whatever. And like him, I just couldn't stop. So literally, like, probably in high school, I started drinking, smoking marijuana. And then like a couple of years into my college, I mean, I already checked myself into my first treatment center. I mean, it was the progression was just insane. And by that time I'm using drugs daily. I've added, cocaine and hallucinogens and other things to the mix, and just absolutely couldn't stop. Literally felt like I was losing my mind. I mean, it was just crazy. At that time, so first of all, my mind wasn't working quite right, but I was really thinking, if there's a God, why would he allow this? Why would he allow this to happen? And I had a lot of skills in music, and I think some promising things that could have happened there. And that was all, kind of going down the tube, just because my life was all about alcohol and drugs. And then that affected my relationships with other people. And so it just went so quick, the roller coaster ride. And by that time, my dad had stopped being a pastor and gone to some other things within the church, but he was traveling some, and he was just kind of out of the picture. And it was just a tough time. So I guess that's sort of maybe chapter 1 or something. So
what was so you said your dad was out, and I guess you're at college and your brother was a couple of years older, but was there a period where you were both at home and your brother potentially before you was starting to spiral out of control? what does that look like in a household where the father is a preacher, and it's
This is a really interesting thing, and I haven't sorted this out yet, really, and I may never.
yeah,
My dad, he's gone now. He died about a little over a year and a half ago. But I got, the Lord used him in a lot of good ways in my life. But there were also some things that I've learned that, to try to not, you want to imitate some things, and other things you think maybe those aren't the best things. And for whatever reason, my dad was, most of the time, he worked so much that he just wasn't, even when he was, before he started traveling with his other work, he just wasn't at home. I mean, it was very typical. We'd wake up to go to school. Dad was already gone at work.
yeah,
We'd see him. He'd come home at night. We did have dinner together a lot, which was good, but it'd be like really quick, and he'd watch about a half hour news, and then he'd go back until late at night. So he was just gone a lot. So I think with my brother, and I tried to talk to my dad a little bit. He had a couple, people that were part of his church that also had kids that were, my brother's age that knew him. And I think several people shared with my dad, they were really concerned about him and the direction he was headed. But my dad either maybe didn't realize it was as bad as it was. By that time, maybe had been out of the picture so much that he didn't know how to get back in and have influence. But the other really interesting thing, Luke, is that, and this will sound really odd as somebody who grew up in a pastor's home, I don't ever remember us sitting down as a family with the Word of God.
yeah.
Like ever. And that's really bizarre. And I certainly heard my dad.
Just for people listening, I guess, that aren't familiar with that term, Word of God is synonym. Another way of saying the Bible. So the family would never sit around and read the Bible.
Right. And I certainly heard him teach from the Bible because he was the main teacher at the churches I grew up in. And we would have during summer, pretty common to have like Christian camps where you go for a week and learn different things. But for whatever reason in our home, it just wasn't there. And so I think, again, just the combination of him being gone a lot, and then that, really, studying the Bible together, praying together, those kind of things just weren't a part of our life as a family. That by the time the family started breaking apart, which was really, my brother's, addictions and behaviors, I think it was too late, or my dad maybe thought it was too late to get back involved. And he and I did talk about that later as I was an adult, and he definitely had a lot of regrets, and especially, like I said, when my brother died at 35. And it's not that, maybe my parents could have done a number of things differently and it wouldn't have mattered, but I think he felt regret over that and not having an influence, earlier in his kids' lives. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you personally started to sort of spiral in your late teens, early 20s, did you think were you a Christian then? Would have you called yourself one?
No.
No.
And it's interesting because I do think that those roots and growing up in that environment where there was certainly a moral compass, and you understood there were certain ways of living that were better or right, or in other ways that weren't. I know that made a tremendous difference, because when you do have a background like that, when you do spiral out of control, you at least have a road to go back to.
Yeah.
And a lot of people maybe don't have that. But no, I thought, and it felt very conscious to me. Like I tried to believe these things, but I didn't believe at that time in the resurrection of Jesus. And to me, if you don't believe in that, it's not that you couldn't still benefit from the moral principles that you find in the Bible, but you certainly, that's the whole hinge pin on which Christianity rests.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so I felt like a very conscious leaving of the faith. Now, whatever faith I had before that, which again may have been more of just a moral compass than an actual personal faith. But at that point, I left and didn't want anything to do with it. I was very angry. Here's the interesting thing. So I'm trying to be an atheist because it is. I've tried to be really consistent in my life, probably to a fault. Like that's important to me. Like whatever I believe, I better be able to back it up. And sometimes, sometimes to the point of maybe being annoying. But I remember I was trying to be an atheist. I mean, I don't believe in this resurrection. I don't believe these things. There's already been a fair amount of suffering in my life just from what happened to my family, my brother. Now I'm hopelessly addicted to these drugs. And it was kind of like just casting the whole thing aside. But yet I would find myself often angry at the God I didn't believe in. So that was confusing. So I guess I was a little bit of an unsuccessful or inconsistent atheist.
And so why? I think it's such an important discussion, the resurrection, because I agree, and I think, I mean, I mentioned to you before our recording, I went to a Catholic school, and none of us actually believe, but everyone's, I mean, I didn't. I was a shocking teenager, but a lot of my friends, they would say, hey, like, there's lots of great teachings and moral values to get out of this, but the whole Jesus sort of dying, being resurrected, coming back and saying hello to his friends and then going up to heaven, like, no one actually believes in that. And so can you talk a little bit about that idea and the idea of Christian values without the resurrection?
Yeah, I think Christian values without the resurrection, there's nothing unique there. I'm no expert on world religions, but I that's something I'm interested in worldviews and why people believe what they believe, whether or not their beliefs are true. And I mean, any system I'm aware of, a religious system, worldview, moral system, philosophical system, all of them have good tenets. And that if people followed some of those tenets, principles, rules, guidelines, whatever, they're probably going to have a little bit better life in terms of more stability, not making a lot of horrible decisions, not completely wrecking the whole thing. There are some good things there in all of those. But again, there's nothing unique about that. And there's really no reason for even a God in that scenario. Some people have better ideas than others and lived life a little bit more successfully. And so if I follow these three things or whatever, I'll probably live more successfully too. But there's not a lot of maybe purpose in it other than pragmatism. And of course, then there's nothing that gives you the assurance of what might come after this life either, except I think just people maybe speculating about it.
Yeah. I was, that was definitely me. I was pragmatic. So I thought you could pick and choose and you can get a little bit of value out of, the teachings of Jesus here and a little bit out of Buddha here and a little bit out of the other religions. And I think that's largely how a lot of people, are living today.
Yeah, sure.
What then? So you're in your early 20s and you're struggling with drug addiction. Why didn't you believe the resurrection then? Because I mean, it is interesting. You said you grew up in the household not actually looking at the Bible, but you were a guy that always asked why and asked questions. What was it that you couldn't come to terms with?
Yeah, so I certainly, even though we didn't spend time at home, I mean, I certainly, learned a fair amount, in other contexts about the Bible, and because it was important to me, if I was supposed to believe something, to know what it was I was supposed to believe. I did read it on my own sometimes, and I still debate to this day sometimes. What was there really a time when I was younger when maybe I did have some type? It would have been a really immature faith, but where I did have some type of legitimate faith, and then just I don't know what you guys in Landon underused for the term, but backsliding, to use that term. Was it just that? Or did I just backslide like as far back as you can slide, or was it, or maybe I didn't really have a legitimate faith? I'm not honestly sure, and I'm happy to let the Lord work out the details on that. But when I didn't believe it, I mean, I knew what the Bible, I knew what it taught, and I understood that they were saying, no, this. I mean, imagine that we're all hanging out with this person who's been really important to us, who's Jesus in the biblical story, and then all your hopes are in him. And there's a lot, that we can't get into in just one episode here, but where a lot of people had a certain idea of who Jesus was supposed to be and what he was supposed to accomplish. And then he wasn't who he was supposed to be and didn't accomplish what some people thought he was supposed to. And they had him murdered. And then there's people running around saying, hey, he's alive 3 days later. I mean, I knew what the teaching was, and the different, in the Bible, it's mostly in what are called the gospel writings, first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They tell this story. But I just thought there's no way that happened. I've never seen anything like that happen. And so again, it was very, very conscious in understanding this is what happens. And if this didn't happen, then like we just talked about a moment ago, then Jesus, I mean, he may have lived a really good life. I knew even at that time that, there within the secular scholarship, I mean, there are a handful of people, for instance, that would say that a person, that was called Jesus never even existed, and they're kind of laughed off the scene, to be honest. There was so much evidence of his life, and I knew that, but I realized if he didn't really rise from the dead, first of all, he wouldn't be honest, because he predicted that he would. And so again, with that, if that didn't happen, then kind of why bother really even following him? But for sure, I'm not going to worship somebody like that.
It's just another philosophy in the mix, but all sorts of philosophy based off the teachings of a liar.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what changed, Joel? So you're in the depths of addiction and trying to fight your way out of it. We know that you've become a pastor. What's the step from there to there?
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. For some reason, I think, that the Lord works in different people's lives different ways, for sure. And he seems to work consistently in the kinds of things he does in people's lives. Now, that's just kind of conjecture and based on my experience.
Yeah.
But I've had several big, almost, earth-shaking type of things that have happened that have changed the course of my life. And all of them were unexpected. And that's exactly what happened here. So I got involved. I had been in and out of some different alcohol and drug treatment centers. I could not stay sober. I had resigned to the fact that I was just going to live my life being addicted to alcohol and drugs. And if I made it, so this is probably my late teens, 20, 21 in there. And then if I made it to 25, that'd be a miracle. And I was just going to do my best, kind of get by. But I did get into, to Alcoholics Anonymous, got involved there. And I'd also tried lots and lots of different AA meetings, and nothing stuck. And I met a couple guys, that really seemed to understand that, again, I'm kind of, for whatever reason, I'm kind of interested in studying and textbooks and what are the basic tenets of this thing, whatever we're studying or learning, what's it based on, what's the foundation, and these guys really knew it. So AA has a book just called the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book. It's a textbook for how to recover from alcoholism, and so I realized if it's a textbook, I can study it, and if it's true, and if I do the things that it says to do, I probably at least have some shot. And by that point, I was willing to try anything, But there were a couple individuals in that were Christians, but they never talked about their Christianity. And I know from talking to them later that was kind of on purpose, because I was so angry a lot of times. I wanted nothing to do with God, and as soon as somebody would say something like, "Well, this is a spiritual solution," I would just get angry. And finally, a guy said to me, "Well, are you willing to at least try this thing?" Or it's kind of like, "Well, how's that working for you? What you're doing on your own?"
Yeah.
And so I did, and I worked through this process of the 12 steps. I mean, really, really thoroughly. Some people don't need to, maybe, and that's fine, but I did. And so this is, and I was so bad, with alcohol and drugs, that I don't even remember exactly when this was, but I think it was 21 or 22, somewhere in there. And I was able to stay sober for the first time, for more than a few days. My life was getting better. I, got a job. I was able to go to, somehow miraculously graduated from college, because I was kind of failing out of there, and I went back to some of my professors and things and kind of explained what was going on. So things were going a lot better at that time. Still no faith in God, wasn't really thinking about God, was still angry at sometimes, but But just because life, go ahead.
Just quickly, Joel. In AA, because I've got a friend who's doing it. It talks about a higher power, doesn't it? There is
Yes.
sort of some sort of spiritual element to it.
Yeah. And the reason for that, again, if you kind of go back to the textbook, and then they have some other literature as well, because it is based on, that's a whole nother story too, but it is based on what was a Christian sect called the Oxford groups, that had these certain ways they were really, really trying to live. But AA, I think the founders, in their wisdom, because a lot of them had a similar story, like they just, I'm speaking generally here, but people who end up with lifestyles of, lots of alcohol, other drugs, it's never usually a pretty thing. And those people aren't usually the people that you'd find and that they want to tell you about how much they love Jesus. I mean, those two things don't go together very often. A lot of times they're angry people, they're bitter people, they're people that blame everyone else for their problems. I did. And so in their wisdom, they realized it was a spiritual solution, but if they started talking about Jesus or specific, religious tenets or whatever you want to call them, that would turn a lot of people off. And AA does not exist to make people Christians. It exists to help people learn how to live without having to use alcohol. Specifically. And then later, more and more people, came in with drug addictions as well. And so that was in their wisdom. And so they kind of say, would you be open to believing that maybe there is something that that's bigger than you that might be able to help with a solution? And they'll even start by saying sometimes maybe that something initially is just this other group of people that's been able to come to a solution in life that you haven't been able to come to. So I think sometimes AA takes some hits maybe from Christians, which I understand, but those Christians maybe don't understand the reason that they do that.
Yeah. And so at that point in time, what did you think about the whole higher power element of it?
Well, I knew that, again, AA's talks about a day at a time, and I knew that a day at a time, eventually I had been sober for a few months, which for me was an absolute miracle and nothing I ever expected people to do. So I'm not the sharpest, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I can figure out, okay, if I can't do this on my own and I keep failing, and I've tried everything I felt like I had, but here I've been sober for a few months now, then it's got to be something other than me that's helping me to do that. And I had worked through these steps, and the promises throughout the 12 steps of AA are very specific. When you've accomplished this step, when you've shared these things about your life, when you've written these things down, there's a lot to that. These things will start to happen. You're going to start to have some freedom. You're going to things that you had some fears in are going to go away. And like every single one of those things happened. And so that was very transformative for me. But still at the time, you certainly wasn't a Christian, wasn't planning on, following Jesus. Again, I just knew that there was something that was working in my life that hadn't worked up to that point.
So then what was the next step out of that? So then you're sober. How did you then come to change your mind on the resurrection?
Yeah. So this is what leads to, again, one of my kind of monumental or watershed moments in my life that the Lord seems to do. So I was 23, and I had a friend who was actually in AA. I lived in Washington State at the time, so at northwest corner of the states, and I had a friend that had moved to Oregon, which is just directly south of Washington State, and she had moved down there basically to shack up with some guy, and it worked for about 3 weeks. But she and I had become friends through AA, and there was a group of us that were friends together. And she called me and she said, "This is not working. Can you come get me? Like, I need to get out of here." I had a VW bus at the time, and when I was playing music and stuff back in the olden days, before all these fancy cars with these electric seats you can take in and out, you can take a wrench and take these big seats out of the middle of the van, and they were out of there because I'd haul around music equipment and stuff. And so I had all this space back there, so I could go grab her and her stuff and move her out of there. And this is what happened. This is, just my story. So it's about a 5-hour drive, and on my way, I was listening to some. You're probably too young for cassette tapes, but this is like some cassette.
I got the tail end of them.
So I'm listening to cassette tapes of a couple guys that from AA, not that I knew locally, but guys that spoke in different things. And by that time, I was realizing something was changing pretty dramatically. I was becoming just happier, less angry. Had just some of the things that a lot of people already have, that because they're not drinking copious amounts of alcohol. But I had a job. Life was okay. I had some friends, but I was maybe halfway there in that drive. So I'm probably 3 hours into the trip or something. And I was listening to these tapes, and these guys, I don't think were believers. They just knew the program well. They're talking about this stuff. And I just start bawling. I just start crying. Even now I get kind of tripped up thinking about it. And I had to pull over to the side of the road. I'm crying so hard I can't see. And I just had, for those of your listeners maybe that know some of the biblical story, it was almost like an Apostle Paul type of situation. Here's a guy, and there are a lot of similarities actually. There's something said about Paul that's really dramatic, and I don't know if because like I shared earlier, I was really angry sometimes at God. I was really angry at Christians, and Paul, who became a very well-known Christian, who started lots of churches and so forth. Before that, he hated Christians, and at one point it actually says that he breathed out murderous threats against these Christians, and really severe. But I could relate to a lot of that. I was just so angry at God, so angry at all these people. I think I was basically angry at myself, and why isn't life working out how I thought it'd be? What's the point or purpose anyway? I didn't have one. And what happened to Paul, he didn't think this was going to happen to him on this day. He's riding on this horse into the city where he actually had letters that were going to allow him basically to take believers out of their homes and have them persecuted. And Jesus shows up and says to him, his name was Saul at that time, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And it's a very well-known story for people who are Christians. And his life has radically changed. And my story was not unlike that. Again, I'm crying at the side of the road. And something, that was the last thing that I planned on happening that day. I thought I was just going to pick up this friend, throw her stuff in my van, and drive back to Washington. And I got at other plans, and I just felt this intense peace and presence. And somehow I knew it was Jesus. Now, unlike Paul seemed to have some type of a vision, and I will see Jesus in his resurrected state. I didn't have that. But I started just praying and crying out. And I basically said, Jesus, if you are the reason, and again, even now I can tear up. If you are the reason for all these changes in my life, and at that point, it's almost like all the things I had learned about the Bible growing up almost just kind of coalesced and came together. And so I am very thankful for that upbringing. And I just said, if this is you and you're the reason for this, I'll follow you. I'll do whatever you ask me to do, the best I can, and go wherever you tell me to go. And now, Luke, I had no idea what I was actually committing to at that point, because it's cost a lot at times. But that happened, and again, I had already changed in some really just helpful, practical ways in my life. And I think there was already a transformation happening, but this just radically changed all that. And I felt like a brand new person. It's something that we would call as Christians being born again. People have different ways of talking about it. And I was completely changed to the point of literally within because I called people, started telling them, and they were like, you don't even sound like the same person. And these were people that had known me for years. And so it was and I'm not saying it, and it doesn't have to happen for everyone that way. Sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, oh, I wish something like that happened to me. And I'll say, well, do you wish you'd gone through all the things before it happened? It's okay, to just have a tame life. And hey, I came to believe at some point, and I love Jesus. That's okay too.
You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so, what did your friend say when you got there to pick her up?
Well, the initial thing there was just getting her stuff out of there. But then But then, yeah, I did talk to her on the way back, and she's someone like I just knew for a little while, and I think she took off somewhere else, and haven't seen her like for decades. So I don't know what happened to her. But I think she kind of, I don't know if she was a Christian, but she certainly didn't have the problem with God that I had, and so I think she was pretty open to it.
Yeah.
And then yeah, but it was wild. Like I got back, and my story is kind of backwards because a lot of times, I mean, I had grown up in church, but I hadn't been to church in years at that point. So,
and at that point, you hadn't. I mean, you said you're listening to. I was laughing when you said cassette tapes. It was like the podcasts of those times, really.
Yeah, exactly.
But those guys weren't believers, so you hadn't even been consuming. Had you been consuming any Christian content, even sort of subconsciously?
Well, there is one weird thing that happened, and I hadn't actually thought about this for quite a while until you just brought it up. But I remember where I was living at the time, I was living with a couple people, kind of like a shared, we were all paying a little rent at this place. And there were a couple of bizarre things that happened. Like I would have I'm thinking about all these old things like radios, like I used a radio for an alarm clock. And I remember that like I woke up a couple days and like there was a Christian station or somebody talking about Christianity, but to my knowledge, like I hadn't changed the station or anything. So there were some couple kind of bizarre things like that happened. But no, I certainly wasn't consciously studying. Like, so that was the last. I mean, if somebody had said to me that morning, "Oh, by the way, in a few hours you're going to be a Christian," I would have laughed at him. And so then after, so a lot of people, they're part of a church, and then maybe they come to faith there. And I was kind of backwards. It's like I'm a Christian. Like I think I actually believe this stuff now, and I think it. One of the things I kind of left out a little bit, and maybe you can relate to this as someone who was an atheist for a long time. I had no idea there was evidence for any of this stuff. Even growing up in the church, I didn't know there was actually any kind of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I didn't realize that there was more manuscript evidence, for the Bible, both Old and New Testament, like far and away more evidence, and more manuscripts that have been collected than any other work of literature. I mean, I had no idea. And so what happened, it's like, I believe this stuff, but I started getting really interested in what the field is called apologetics for Christians, which means basically being able to give a reason for the hope that you have, and the Greek word's just apologia. And then started studying all this
I never
stuff.
knew, until the first probably couple of months of becoming Christian, I never knew the term, I never knew what apologetics was. I didn't know that there was people that actually defended with logic and reason these beliefs. I just thought it was all just beliefs, just based on sort of passed down traditions.
Yeah.
So you got right into the apologetic space.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it was kind of wild because I was, it was a few weeks after this, and then I was kind of talking, and these guys at that point, then the guys that had been helping me so much in AA that were Christians, then, well, now I'm a Christian. So I started talking to them, asking all these questions, and I'm like, what do I do now? And one of them was like, I don't know. Have you ever thought about becoming part of a church or something? You might want to try that. So then I got really involved in this church. But yeah, then I was like studying, and I was so hungry, and I was reading the Bible all the time, and I started reading all these other books that, and I was asking all these people questions. And that's been a big part of, like right now, I mean, for years, but now as well, like I don't want anybody else to go through that, like you don't have to, ruin your life in order for it to be good. But I'm very comfortable talking to atheists. I'm very comfortable talking to agnostics, which is just somebody without a particular knowledge of something. I'm very comfortable talking to people that are angry at God. I'm comfortable with people that have questions. That sometimes as Christians we give these short, pat answers. Like they'll say, "Well, why is there suffering in the world?" We'll say, "Well, actually, you might suffer for a while, but it's going to turn out just fine." I mean, those aren't very satisfactory answers. I'm comfortable with those tough questions because I've had them. So that's one of the things I'm thankful for. Is because of my story and my experience, the Lord has used me to have, I think, surprising conversations.
Yeah.
And in fact, great story here. Just if I can just throw one in here, because this just happened.
Definitely.
One of my best friends in junior high, part of high school. I mean, he's a guy that I got in trouble with a lot too, and it was his fault. No, but we got in some trouble together. But again, I've moved, a couple times as an adult and things, and kind of lost track of him. But on Facebook, and another thing that wasn't around when I was growing up, you make all these connections. And so my friend's name was Scott. This guy, again, one of my best friends growing up, and his son had heard about me because my friend Scott and I were in a band and stuff, and his son plays guitar and all this stuff. So he found me on Facebook and just like, hey, it'd be fun to, I knew your dad and all this stuff. But this was about 3 years ago, and this guy, his son was an atheist and a pretty outspoken atheist. There's nothing to this Christianity. They're kind of dumb. Why would anybody believe this kind of stuff? And I engaged in some conversations with him, and he told me that he's really surprised that I would even kind of talk to him, and I was being kind to him and nice to him. Well, just literally, like probably a month ago, he sent me a message. He said, this is kind of a weird thing, but he said, I was totally wrong. I've accepted Jesus. I'm growing. I'm learning all this stuff. And one of the things he said, I don't save anybody, none of us do. But he said, even in that, he reiterated. He said that, thank you for when I was so opposed to God that you were kind to me. I was really surprised at that. And I also told him, kind of asked him, have you ever? This is when we first started talking. Have you ever? Do you know that there's actually some good evidence for these things? And he had no idea. Yeah, and not everybody needs that.
Yeah.
Some people don't. They just have this faith, a simple faith, and I don't mean simple in any type of negative or pejorative sense. They don't need that kind of evidence.
Yeah.
I did, and so does this guy, and so do other people. And so, I think the Lord in His wisdom maybe brings some of us through things so that then we can help others who need to get through those same things. So
definitely. While I've got you on this topic, Joel, I'd love to fire a few questions at you from an apologetics point of view. The one you mentioned then is probably the question I get the most, particularly people that are sort of a little bit interested in trying to wrap their head around things, is why does God allow suffering?
Yeah. So I'm not going to give people like a 10-second answer. And here you go. I don't know. I have some ideas, but it's a difficult question to answer. I think what's important for me is, regardless of why he does that, because you have people, even Christians and people, theologians that are people who study this stuff a lot, that will come up with some different things. And I think there are some good answers there. Like, for example, if we didn't have suffering or go through things that were bad or negative, how would we know those things that were good?
Yeah.
We have to have a context to compare things, to know how good God is to know what things are like without that God. Another, I think, reasonable response is that that's not a question that only has to be answered for believers, but for anybody on the planet. Like for example, if evolution were true, doesn't solve that issue either. And if evolution were true, we wouldn't have even really, if we were going to be consistent, we wouldn't even have a sense of what good or bad is. There wouldn't be. There would be reason for nothing. But I think what's most important in that is that God, in the Christian worldview, which I hold, sends His Son into this suffering, and Jesus suffered too. In fact, Jesus suffered a lot. Jesus was betrayed by His very best friends, and Jesus, the way I understand it and what the Bible teaches, is by His crucifixion and then death and resurrection, He gives us a way to have forgiveness from our sins. And having that forgiveness in our sins allows us to live free in this life, allows us to live in lives with purpose, allow us to have compassion and empathy and go into that suffering for other people. And so as He came into this world to suffer on our behalf, that then gives us the ability to enter into other people's suffering. And I think as a believer too, we know that one day we have a life after this life that we're in now. where that, and I don't know exactly, exactly what that looks like, but where we don't experience that, that the suffering that we have now. And so for me, I don't think I could give anybody a satisfactory answer to why God allows suffering. And again, God doesn't seem to shy away from that. I mean, it's part of the biblical story, but God's Son, Jesus, is sent into this world to suffer on our behalf, and then to give us the ability as believers to help with suffering. And as much as the church sometimes gets a bad rap, and I was a person, who certainly did that at one point, I think our world is drastically different and drastically better since the church, because the church has done so much to alleviate suffering and to alleviate poverty and to educate people to be able to do more on their own. I mean, look at, again, I don't know Australia so well, but I mean, here, pretty much every hospital, St. Luke's, St. John's, St. Matthew's, schools, all these
it's the
things.
same story here, and we're a pretty secular country.
Yeah. And so I think that's, it's that God doesn't leave us just to suffer and say, good luck.
Yeah.
but it enters into that suffering on our behalf to show that even in that suffering, we can have love and empathy and compassion, forgiveness and grace, and all these things that people desperately need.
Yeah, perfect. And what, another apologetics question, what do you think's the best criticism someone levels against the faith of Christianity, and then what's your answer to it?
Well, one we've already talked about a little bit. I think a lot of people would maybe realize that, okay, this resurrection story is just nonsense. And I'm going to come back to that, but I think another one is that's on a more kind of, I guess it's everyday, ordinary level, is people will say, well, Christians are hypocrites and they don't live lives like they should. And my response to that would be, there's a sense in which that's right. I mean, none of us live the kind of lives that we wish we could live, but that's not God's fault. That's us, continuing to fail. And I think that people that are sincere believers, we realize that we need help, and that's why we need local fellowship. That's why we want to be part of a church or have relationships with other believers, because we know we need that help. So we're acknowledging, no, it is because I am sinful. Sin at its heart just means missing the mark. Like if you think of a target with a bullseye on it and you're missing it, and Christians realize, no, we need that help. So yes, I am a hypocrite, but God saves me anyway. He loves me anyway, and that's not an excuse. We should still try over time to continue to mature in our faith and live lives that are better. But that's the response. The response to that is, no, I'm not saying I'm better than you. I'm not saying I don't still make mistakes, but I have this God who loves me and is really helping me, and my focus is on Him. In other words, we want to live lives that are exemplary so that people could follow us, but we're not responsible ultimately for that. People need to follow Jesus, and one of the things that I love about Him is that He has never let me down, whereas other people have. I've let myself down, I've let other people down, but He just gets better and better. And so my role in that, if people come up to me and say, the church has done bad things, people are inconsistent, look at these things, and you've got, news stories with celebrity pastors and all the rest of it, I'll say, well, don't put your hope in them, put your hope in Jesus, Going back to the resurrection, there are lots of reasons, and again, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to believe, because I don't think any of us have seen that happen. But that's part of where faith comes in too. And I don't see faith. Faith isn't like a blind leap into a dark chasm. The biblical faith is something that we can, that it can be evidentiary and we can put our trust in. But there's a lot of things with the resurrection. Is that if you read, and I'll try to keep this fairly brief, but if you read through the main stories in the Bible that talk about that, again, that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you see it in other places, but those are essentially kind of biographies of the life of Jesus. The way they're written, it's so honest. Like if you were going to write things to make up a religion, you wouldn't include a lot of the stuff they have in there. And one example is, at that time, and unfortunately, women's thoughts, women's opinions, nobody really cared. It was like the men and the animals and the ladies, kind of honestly, it seems like in that culture. But you have women being the first ones that find that the tomb is empty, and you have them telling people, well, what did the men that they told say? We don't believe these silly women and their tales. Well, that's just what you'd expect. And then you've got these Roman guards outside there. That was a pretty big job to protect that. And they're saying, well, the body's gone. People must have come and stolen it while we were sleeping. Well, how would you know what was happening when you're sleeping? And you've got just all these stories that seem like they're just honest stories. And as you read the stories, you realize that the first people that are told about Jesus' resurrection, none of them believe it. Nobody thought it was going to happen. It's not like I'm stealing this from a pastor who preached on this once, but, nobody was standing outside the tomb, 10, 9, 8, 7. I mean, and the way this pastor put it was nobody expected no body. I mean, it was a surprise to everybody, just like it would be for us today. But then you have these same men who are referred to as, Jesus' apostles or sometimes disciples, that were apparently hiding in this room because they were, when all this went down with Jesus, they were afraid, of what was going to happen to them too, because they followed him. And then you've got, within a period of, seems like just a few days or a few weeks, they're out boldly proclaiming that this Jesus has now been resurrected. I mean, that was their whole preaching was based on that. And they're doing that at their own peril, realizing that they could be killed for believing these things and following his teachings. And that's exactly what happened to many of them. It's like, why would you do that? Now, it would be one thing if they thought it was true, but if they knew it was a lie, why would they do that? And then you've got all these stories that come up. Well, that are crazier than the truth. Either, well, Jesus didn't really die, and okay, so you've got this guy who's bloodied apparently beyond recognition, and what do? You hold him up and walk through town and say, this is my resurrected Savior. I mean, not to be crude about it, but then in a period of decades, you've got the whole Roman Empire seemingly sort of turned on its head. How does this stuff happen? And again, like we kind of started at the beginning, if Jesus is just another teacher, we don't have a church, we don't have Christianity, we don't have hospitals called St. Luke, St. Peter, we don't have any of this. We just have maybe some memory of some guy that said some good things, but lied about a lot of stuff too. And so the very fact that the church is here, and who knows what the numbers are for sincere believers, but I've heard as many as 2 billion people in some way, shape, or form claim a faith in this Jesus. And there's other evidence too, but those are the main things I might bring to the table.
Yeah. I think my point to add is that, and I agree with what you've said there. I would have disagreed with it baselessly 5 years ago, because I would have never had an answer on it. But the challenge I put to myself, the non-believing Luke 5 years ago, and anyone else, is I don't think anyone can doubt the historical significance of this guy, Jesus of Nazareth. So, and every religion, every worldview, he's going to come up in it, somehow. So I think if you're going to work out your worldview, you just need to get your head around who this guy was.
Yeah.
And it's been a great journey for me to learn that. So, Joel, we opened at the start saying, what's the point anyway? And you've had this sort of crazy journey to come to faith. I guess it's not a happily ever after when you hit 23 and became Christian. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about then what life's looked like for you after that, and then sort of particularly in the last 5 years or so?
Yeah. So it's, there's for sure been some difficult things, some wonderful things, but some difficult things. When I made that commitment, at 23, if this is you, Jesus, I'll follow you wherever you ask me to go and do whatever you ask me to do. Now, I have fumbled the ball on that journey a lot. I'll be the first one to say that. But by his grace, I have tried to do that. No one else has saved my life in the way that he did, and he has. That one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible, it's just a short one, but Proverbs 30 and verse 5 says, every word of God proves true. I've seen that over and over and over and over and over and over in my life. But it does cost sometimes too. And so, I especially leading up to to more recently, I've been kind of a studier of the Bible, that whole time. So I'm 54, so that's 30 some years, and then the knowledge I had growing up to. And I don't think I understand things perfectly. I've still got a lot to learn. I probably have some things I believe that are not quite right, but I never know quite what they are until that I see them somewhere or somebody points them out. But during COVID, so obviously there's a lot that transpired in between there. But this is really at the heart of my story today. Like a lot of churches, we didn't meet for a few weeks, and I had a little more time to study because we just didn't have a lot going on. And this was another thing very similar to kind of my dramatic, conversion to Christianity. And again, like I mentioned, I've had a couple other things like that along the way that I won't be able to touch on all of them here. But during that time, I started studying more. So this is 2020 in there, and I was trying to figure out how do you be a pastor when you're not meeting on Sundays, you don't have Bible studies. I had only been the pastor of this church for a few months, and it's important to get to know your people. And how do I do that? And I decided to talk about the last few days of Jesus's life, and I was going to make these videos, like just short 8 to 10 minute videos, and send them out to the people that went to the church. And then we weren't even going to meet on Easter. And I mean, the whole thing was just really weird. And so then on Easter Sunday, I was going to send out the last video, which was the resurrection of Jesus. So basically I started with the Sunday 1 week before his resurrection, and I was going to end with the Sunday of his resurrection, and again, just do kind of a video for each day talking about what was happening in Jesus's life. Because I've always thought that's kind of interesting. Like, what if he really is who he said he was? Like, what were the last few days of the life of the most important person who ever lived? I thought that was kind of a fascinating thing. And when you're reading about those days in the Bible, I mean, everything slows down and there's way more ink given to those last few days of his life. It's really important. And within that, I had no idea this would happen, any more than I was going to, have that roadside experience coming to Christ. I ended up seeing a lot of things that related to the term for it in biblical studies is called eschatology, which is the last things or the end things. And because Jesus, before his death, talked about a lot of these things that were going to happen, and he predicted these things. Again, I'm trying to kind of give Cliff's notes here for time, but he talked about this temple was going to fall, which we don't have much of a relationship with a temple the way those people did, but it was the whole hub of that whole Jewish religious system, and where they had all these animal sacrifices, this priesthood, all these things. And Jesus predicted that temple was going to fall. He talked about earthquakes. He talked about famine. He talked about pestilence. He talked about false messiahs, all these things. And I had believed, since I was a Christian, that initially I thought all those things were at the end of the world. And then over time, I thought, well, maybe some of the things happened earlier at his time, but most of them happened at the end of the world. And then it was like, well, maybe a few less of them happened at the end of the world. So there were certainly some changes, my view there. But what happened during this time in 2020 is I came to the conclusion, again, not planning to whatsoever, that actually the things Jesus was talking about there were not referring to the end of the world, but they were actually all referring to the end of that what we call the old covenant system, that Jewish religious system, that the temple, the sacrifices, all of those things. And that view within Christianity is often referred to as fulfilled eschatology, or sometimes preterism. Preterism just comes from a Latin word, praeter, and it means past things. And I came to embrace this view that's obviously very different than what traditional Christianity holds. And as a result of that, without going into all the details, and again, I'm not trying to make myself out to be the good guy or to be an angel through all this, but I lost my position as a pastor, and you kind of alluded to that at the beginning of the program. I lost my marriage. I've lost contact with my children. and just went through, I don't know how you could describe it other than hell for for quite a while. Um, and things, things have gotten a little bit better. My interestingly, there's a dichotomy here, because on the one hand, if I hadn't been trying to follow Jesus, again, the best that I could, it's likely that none of this would have ever happened. I mean, I would have to back up way back in my life, and who knows what that would have looked like. But certainly, none of this would have happened if it weren't for trying to follow Jesus. At the same time, without Jesus, I couldn't have possibly gotten through it. And I also have amazing friendships. I mean, some people have helped a tremendous amount. But so sometimes, and again, I want to make sure your listeners here, I'm not saying I'm faultless, or that I haven't made bad decisions long. I'm not saying any of that. But to the best of my knowledge, this is what the Bible teaches, and I couldn't deny the one who saved me. And so it's always worth it following Jesus wherever he leads, and in doing that, again, I would have never chosen these circumstances. It's been incredibly difficult, something I never ever would have expected ever. In fact, I did a talk recently at a conference that I think you listened to, and the way I started that talk was, I never would have believed that I ever would believe what I now believe. So it's been a crazy journey, but that's just what I think is true. And if I'm going to worship somebody and give my life to them, I have to believe what they said was true. And it seemed to me, at the heart of this for me, is more really than just eschatology. It's more than just a right view of the end times.
Yeah.
It's, did Jesus actually accomplish what he said he would? And as I read the scriptures, he said he would return and all these things would happen within that present generation he was living in. And his students, his apostles, seemed to all be teaching the same thing. And they said they were teaching nothing different than what the prophets in the Old Testament taught. And if I put that all together, either they were telling the truth and these events already took place, even though I may not understand exactly how that all worked out.
Yeah.
Or they were dishonest and they weren't telling the truth. And I just can't
Your
follow
faith's in vain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of what's happened there in a nutshell. And it's it's been rough. But the Lord does sustain, and the sun comes up still every morning, and things have gotten a little bit easier.
It's incredible. I'll put Joel in the show notes. I'm going to put a link to the 2 sermons you gave at that Arkansas conference. The first where you talk about sort of the Old Testament prophecies, and the second where you expand on that story in a lot greater detail, so people listening to it can hear that. I mean, one thing that I'm just putting myself in the shoes of, and you sort of answered it a little bit, but the shoes of someone that's maybe not Christian and hears that, if you ask someone, what's the point anyway? A lot of people might say, get a nice job and have a nice marriage and have a good relationship with your kids. And all of that's been taken from you for just something that you believe in, and not even something that you believe in terms of the faith, but an interpretation of it. Has there been points where you're like, I'll yield on this view, or you just can't do it?
I just can't do it.
Yeah.
I had moments, certainly when I was considering this, because I knew I had a suspicion that, like, I thought with the church, for example, I hadn't really even radically changed how I was teaching, but I just realized that a lot of the scriptures were going to be different than they had been as I did teach them. And I started certainly teaching some things differently, but I in my mind, I thought, because I did struggle with that for a long time. It's like, I didn't need to say anything to anybody. I had different people I had met online that believed this. I could have just, still had some relationships with them, but I didn't have to do it. I didn't feel like the Lord would be, like shaking his finger at me, or something if I didn't do it. But I just believed that it was true, and it actually helped make way more sense out of the Bible than it ever had before. I mean, it's not that there weren't a lot of things that were helpful, but so I did come to that conclusion. But what I thought would happen, is that maybe eventually, maybe some of the people from the church might say, "Hey, we're not comfortable with that. What are you doing?" And I knew it would cause, and this is a whole separate issue too. I want to be perfectly general about, but it caused a tremendous turmoil in the marriage, just because my wife at the time had different beliefs that she had, but in my mind, this was eventually going to cause some issues, and they eventually came a lot quicker than I ever expected. But
Yeah.
but no, I never had even now, if I could go back and do it over again, I might maybe respond to some things in different ways in hindsight, but I don't. Yeah, I have never really. I can't, in good conscience, not teach these things about Jesus, because I believe that's what he said, and I believe that's what he taught, and I believe he rose from the dead, and he's my savior, and I love him. So no, I couldn't deny that.
Incredible. Joel, I'm wary of your time, and you've been so generous sharing it with me and sharing your story, and I guess being so open about it. I wouldn't mind just finishing on sort of one final question. You've spoken so much about your faith that is, just such an incredibly strong faith that, was forged in fire and
Yeah.
took some time to get to where it was. But then once you got there, it is so strong, as we can see. Have you got faith that your personal circumstances will all be resolved? There's a famous, the book of Job, where, he has all these
Right.
all these sufferings, and then everything's made good at the end. Do you have faith in that, or is your faith in something greater, and you accept that perhaps you might live out your days without having all of these things restored back to you?
Yeah, I think that's really up to the Lord. I do think there's something greater than that. I do, and again, this is something that Jesus teaches about all the time. Basically, not to put, and none of those. Those are all wonderful things, but not to put our hope ultimately in those things, but to put our hope in Him. And kind of the funny thing is, and again, I don't know as much about Australia, but and American Christianity, and there are some wonderful things too, but there is kind of this idea that if you follow Jesus, everything in your life gets easier in a temporal sense. And the irony to that is that Jesus' closest friends and followers all were murdered, because of believing in him. So it's like, I don't really know how that disconnect has happened, but that is just not biblical teaching, that everything gets easier in a temporal sense. Now, oftentimes things do, and we should be thankful for that. But if I never had some of those other things again, I hope that I do. But if I don't, that's not going to change my faith in the Lord. And I feel like I have an incredibly rich life, like beyond anything. Seriously, just because of the Lord. If I found out, even if somebody came and told me, "Hey, you're gonna die in a week," or something like that, and I would love to live for a long time, because I want to. I think I'm in a position, because of what I've gone through, to have at least some influence over some people, and the Lord's already used that, and I'm so thankful for that. I want to be able to help other people. But if I found out, okay, you're gone on a week, I have lived such a rich, full, wonderful life in Christ that I'd be okay with that too. He's never let me down. Every word of his proves true, and but he's a good God, and so I suspect there are already some circumstances have gotten better just over time, and from the work that he's given me and some other things, and so I wouldn't be surprised if those things come back. But my faith and my love for Jesus isn't going to change if he's got a different plan. So,
amen. Well, thanks so much, Joel. You're definitely in my prayers, and whatever the circumstances come from it, I think I've been so, there's so much admiration for me looking at you, that you aren't, complaining about your situation. You continue to be a light. Even just coming on here and talking to, whoever's listening about what the point of life is. And I think what you've shown is your views on it, whether someone wants to agree with it or disagree with it. you put your money where your mouth is, and you've got conviction in it, and the fruits of that are showing. You've had everything taken from you, and you've still got a smile on your face. So, Joel, I really, really appreciate it, and I'm glad we've got to chat, and I hope we can continue to speak again in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be on your show.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joel. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit like and subscribe to get notified when the next episode is live.